welcome again to this conversation that takes place in connection with the launch of the Localization Action Guide that has been produced by Local Futures. My name is Anja Lyngbaek, and I'd like to introduce the people behind this guide. I'm going to start with the coordinator of this project, Carly Gayle, who is sitting in a very tropical looking environment. Carly is our project coordinator, and she's the coordinator of the Localization Action Guide. She is also a coordinator of other projects with Local Futures, like our online Planet Local series. And she is also like a chief information manager. And when you look at the Action Guide, you'll see why she is that. She has worked and lived in Indonesia and Madagascar, where she's been involved in permaculture and regenerative design. And when she is not busy with Local Futures, she is also studying herbal medicine. Then we have Steve Gorelick, who has been with Local Futures since 1987. And we are really pleased that you are still staying on so we can benefit from all your knowledge. He is the programs director at Local Futures. He's the author of many articles, blogs of the book Big is Subsidized, the co-author of Bringing the Food Economy Home, and co-producer of the Economics of Happiness film, which has been a very, very important resource at Local Futures. Those of you that entered at the beginning would have heard that Steve is a farmer in Vermont. And so when he's not working with Local Futures, you will find him tending the goats or milking a cow, maybe fixing a tractor or things like that. And not least, Alex Jensen, who is a very important person here at Local Futures as like a master researcher. I know you don't like me saying that, but it is true, so I'm going to say it. He's also the coordinator of Local Futures Ladakh project that has been going on for many years. He is involved with the International Alliance for Localizations and produces our IAL weekly newsletter there. He's involved with many networks like the Degrowth, the Global Tapestry of Alternatives that helped start the Vikalp Sangam network. And when he's not working with Local Futures, he loves to go trekking and camping in the mountains and bird watching. So welcome to the three of you. So I'm going to start with a few questions about the guide, and then we'll want to hear from our participants that I'm sure will have lots of questions to you too. So just starting with the obvious for those people that might not have seen the action guide yet, haven't heard so much about our work. Steve, could you say a little bit about what we mean by localization? I mean, how do we define it, and why do we need a guide?
Well, the short answer is that localization is about bringing the economy back to a human scale. But I think it's helpful to look at localization in light of what it's a response to and what it's the opposite of, which is globalization. So right now, wherever any of us are sitting, our own governments and big business are working together to push the economy in the direction of larger scale and even longer supply chains, and still more consumerism with all the resource usage and waste that entails, and towards more homogenized societies in which people eat pretty much the same foods, wear pretty much the same clothes, build their homes out of pretty much the same materials, with all of those needs met by a relative handful of global corporations. Today, policymakers and business leaders are too circumspect, I think, to come right out and say that that's what their goals are. But back in the 1990s, when the free trade era was really getting off the ground, and before the opposition to globalization had really coalesced, sometimes you could hear essentially those sentiments expressed very directly. My favorite example of that was an annual report from Campbell's Soup, where the CEO said that he was literally shivering with business excitement over the prospects that free trade opened up, allowing the company to penetrate overseas markets. And he was particularly excited because NAFTA had just passed, and the market for soup in Mexico, where there's something like 9 billion portions of soup served every year, most of which was traditional and homemade, that offered an opportunity for the company to replace that traditional homemade soup with Campbell's canned products. When that happened, of course, it would increase the company's profits, and as the CEO said, their shareholders would be cheering wildly. So to speak somewhat metaphorically, globalization is about replacing the self-reliance of homemade soup with dependence on a global soup manufacturer. And localization, it's partly about resisting that process and partly about renewal, which is to create living alternatives that allow us to replace dependence on global corporations with local self-reliance. And I know that that's not a very complete or full explanation of either localization or globalization. So I recommend Helena Norberg-Hodges' book, Local is Our Future, for that. And also on our website, the Local Futures website, there's, I think it's called Learn and Act section, where you can find that whole thing discussed. And I think you asked, Anja, why do we need a guide to localization? And over the years, whether we're at a conference or a lecture or a webinar like this, probably the most common response we get from people is that, okay, you've explained the need for this global to local shift. Now, what can I do? And though we've had that, resist and renew kind of general response, and we could maybe suggest a specific action or two that people could take, there's no way we could provide the full range of actions that people could take and that people are already taking around the world. And so this action guide is really a response to that "what can I do" question. It's a much fuller response.
And I can nod to that because I'm also familiar with that question at every talk, conference, and workshop we've given. I
wanted to add, Anja, that on a deeper level, the guide is, we worked on this guide for so long and so hard because we really believe that if there's any hope of avoiding real social and environmental catastrophe, then millions of people need to essentially join hands to oppose those forces that are pushing us in that direction.
Yes.
And to create those living alternatives that can equitably meet human needs without destroying the biosphere. So really the action guide is a way of encouraging some of those millions of people to act. Yeah, and hopefully it will feel really empowering to see all the options that really are out there. Carly, I wonder if you could just give us a brief glimpse of the action guide, because there might be people that haven't seen it yet. So if you could just give us a quick intro, maybe screen share, so people can see what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks.
Okay. So, welcome everyone. here's the homepage of our localization guide. Actionguide.localfutures.org is the URL. And so this guide is currently centered on our right now 146 actions. And you can find these through two structures in the top menu. So the first one is themes, such as food, energy, and community. And the second menu is actors. So this is where you can find actions that will work well for whatever sphere you're working in, whether it's making changes in your individual life, whether you're working within a community setting, campaigning governments for policy change from the local to the national, international level, working within your small business or through an institution like a school or your university or workplace. So up here, we also have an about page, which shares more about the guide, about localization and local futures, and our FAQ page, which answers some common questions like, will this guide be translated? And how can I suggest something to add? Which was based on our review period with the International Alliance for Localization Volunteers. So scrolling further down on the homepage, we have the same two menus of themes and actors, and you can look for these icons throughout the guide to orient you. And want to give thanks to Brenna Quinlan in Australia for creating these beautiful illustrations for us, as well as the globes at the top. And so I want to go ahead and mention also that these themes are not the extent of local economies. We recognize that several important ones, such as education, infrastructure, health, and more, are absent. We'd like to add those in a future update. We had plenty of material to work with for this first release. So scrolling further down, we have here on the homepage a random sample of actions from across the themes to just give an idea of what those cards look like. So the majority of actions in this guide are related to renewal or building new initiatives from the ground up, but we also have many concrete suggestions for resisting the domination of the global economy and taking policy actions to support those grassroots ones. And related to that, we then have a paragraph on local action and systemic change. And down here, a related quote from Helena. And we expand upon this in the about page over here. So again, this has a primer about globalization, localization, the relationship between resistance and renewal, and top-down and bottom-up changes between policy and grassroots. And then further down, we have more information about local futures with a link of credits for people who helped with the website, contributed to this guide, and link to more resources on Local Futures main website. So I'll go back up to the themes, but before diving into that, I just want to give a quick shout out to Rachel Taylor from Curio Creative and Another Escape magazine for helping us figure out the structure, flow, and copywriting of the whole site. It's a huge amount of information. Figuring out how to organize it was succinctly and sensibly. It was a really massive job, and we really appreciate her work, as well as that of our design studio, Halo, who we'll hear from later. Anyway, so back up to the themes menu. Let's go ahead and take a look at food. So each of our 6 theme pages starts with a quick introductory paragraph. Like the home page, we then have a list of randomly selected example actions, and then a list of topics related to food that we will go into greater detail. I'll come back to these. And then on each of these, we have our 6 big picture essays written by Steve. And so we really encourage people to read these essays in full when undertaking these actions, since they provide a conceptual framework for grounding actions from the very smallest to the most ambitious in the framework of systems change. So picking a topic, say urban farming. So like the essays, each of our topic pages starts with a quick big picture overview. And this is a list of, finally, not randomly selected, but all the actions that we came up with for the topic. I'll come back to that in a minute. So below that, we have 3 additional categories of information to help place the actions in context. So Voices from the Field features video and audio stories from people who really walk the talk and have direct experience with the actions in this topic, as well as for some documentaries, podcasts, webinars, and other audiovisual resources that expand on the topic. So in the policy field, which we have for some topics, explores both policy recommendations for increasing the success of and complementing grassroots action, as well as stories of successful policy actions from around the world. And then finally at the bottom for resources, these are additional written resources such as articles, briefs, and reports that provide more background information about the topic. So let's finally get to these action cards. So here's create community orchards and food forests. So we have a quick introduction at the top of each that again grounds the action in the greater context of localization and systems change. Then for each we have a series of take action suggestions. So these are featuring guides, handbooks, maps, directories, other resources that offer some kind of concrete guidance or suggestions on how to carry out actions related to, in this case, community orchards and food forests. And then each one, as we scroll down the card, has a Get Inspired section, which contains examples similar to those in our Planet Local database. And we've tried to make this as global as possible. So if this one, for instance, has examples from the US, Canada, Croatia, Sri Lanka, the UK, and Australia of successful orchards and forests that are really innovative and each bring a different angle. So a couple more cards in this section. Abandoned and vacant spaces, community composting, starting an urban farm. And then for some of these, you'll see we have policy action. And so I want to mention for some cards, especially the policy actions, the majority of our resources are country specific. When you see these, they'll be marked with either in the US, or across the US, like in the UK in parentheses, for instance. If we don't have that, we think and hope that the resource will be applicable to you, no matter where you are, or in a variety of contexts, regardless of the country it came from. So we always welcome suggestions for continuing to diversify the resources and examples throughout the guide and increase its relevance worldwide. So we'll definitely encourage you to submit feedback and ideas for additions through our form here on the FAQ page. So yeah, that concludes our tour.
Yeah.
Back to you, Anja.
Thank you, Carly. I can't help ask a question, which I have, of course, I know the answer to it, but it was one of the first questions I had when I saw, the draft for the guide, and that was, why are there no images? Because we are really accustomed to seeing images on websites and also on digital guides. So it still remains like a I think a mystery for many. So could you say something about that?
Sure, and you were not alone. That is our most frequently asked question. The lack of images was deliberate. It's not just that we ran out of time. And so from the beginning, our design studio, Halo, is committed to low carbon design. And we learned throughout this process that the internet is responsible for about 4% of carbon emissions worldwide, and that's more than the entire aviation industry, and it's growing pretty rapidly, like about 5% every year. So this huge, hidden energy consuming thing, it's not just the energy that's used to store and stream all of these audio and video and clips and images, but it's also the physical raw materials needed to create and construct and maintain these server centers and the vast infrastructure of telecommunications that makes all this possible. So images and video in particular are one of the heaviest users of data and one of the biggest contributors to this system. So the website that they designed without the images, without embedded videos, uses only about 20% of the energy of a typical website. And so that was a deliberate decision, both to decrease the load of this website and this guide on the biosphere and the carbon emissions, and also to promote access for everyone, because also websites with tons of images and video tend to load really slowly, so it makes it less accessible for folks who are on mobile phones or folks in areas that have low internet bandwidth. So both for the environment and accessibility. And also just thinking consciously about how much information we really need and how much we have, and how much of including images and video is just kind of like playing into the yeah, just like driving, like almost like advertising, driving people toward this. So that was all a conscious decision to minimize the footprint of the guide in many ways and focus on the core information needed.
Thank you for sharing that, Carly. Can I just say, when you move, I think your headset is making a sound, although you seem to keep very still, but so just making note of that.
We'll work on our tech, everyone. Thanks so much.
Right, okay.
I'll go on mute now then.
Yeah. Yes, so I forgave the lack of images. I have to say I was very critical of the lack of image, but I forgave it when I learned how much energy we saved. It really did make sense. So back to, I have a question here for you, Alex, now. Alex and I, we were, a couple of years back, we were thinking about this localization action guides. At that time, we were thinking about 10 steps to localization. Now this mushroomed into 146 actions in this guide, and there are more, as Carly was pointing out, whole topics that we haven't reached yet. So what criteria did you use to choose the actions that are in the guide at the moment? I mean, that must have been really difficult.
Yeah, thanks, Anja. And just to point out that 146 is just it's not a sacred number by any means.
Good to know.
And it's sure to expand with the next version of, or the next update of the guide. So, but in terms of the criteria we use, this sort of returns to the issue that Steve and also Carly pointed to, which is the resistance and renewal framework that has long guided Local Futures work. Simultaneously recognizing the urgent need to both stop and reverse the destructive dominant economic system of corporate power and globalization, and also to protect, regenerate, and create healthy, nourishing local alternatives. So we sought out actions that are doing one or the other of these, and in some cases doing both. And you could also argue that to the extent that projects and initiatives of renewal are withdrawing support and power from the dominant destructive system, they are also political forms of resistance. So one could say that all the actions entail varying degrees of resistance and renewal along a spectrum. However, that being said, explicit political action is paramount in the form of government policies and laws that rein in corporate power and destructive production, and those that encourage local ecological production and local economies instead. So I would, consider these the most important sorts of actions. The policy context in which we move and act significantly structures the sphere of action and possibilities, and profoundly affects our lives, even down to the personal, psychological, and physical level. So for example, consider pesticides, which are now so ubiquitous in the environment that they even fall from the sky in rain. To address this, we need to ban the production of pesticides, to turn off the tap, as it were, alongside building or rebuilding a thriving patchwork of diverse, small-scale, localized agroecological farms. So if you compare banning pesticides or single-use plastics or factory animal farms, et cetera, across an entire county or municipality or country by law, compared to voluntarily abstaining from them on enlightened farms or by conscious individuals, the policy action is obviously going to have the greater impact at the level of urgency that is demanded by the ecological crisis. But, I personally wouldn't want to put this as a zero-sum equation, as against or in competition to community level or individual level grassroots actions for renewal. Rather, I think it's important. These two kinds of actions are important, mutually reinforcing complements, or more intimate forms of engagement can serve as portals to understanding and then organizing politically to address systemic problems. In the other direction, only making policy change without also regenerating practical hands-on skills and knowledge for local ecological living is probably inadequate. So we need both, and we've tried to be mindful of this dual need in the guide through the actions and examples, and also through the text intros accompanying each theme, topic, and action that Carly pointed to.
Thank you, Alex. We already got some good questions here, and I'll come to them in a minute, and also some interesting comments. I just want to ask the three of you just to get a sense of kind of more concretely about the actions that I included. If you were to take your own situation, the three of you, what types of actions do you consider to be relevant in your specific context? Can you just give some example, each one of you, so we can get like a taste? Who wants to go first?
Maybe I'll start. I mean, I live in a very rural area, and so in my context, there are some of the actions in the guide, say around urban farming or reclaiming vacant lots for agriculture or something. They just simply don't apply in my context. And I think that's something to be aware of with this guide, is that we're trying to talk to people, whether they live in cities or suburban areas or rural areas. And so there are actions that will not be relevant to everyone. Sharing your lawn for someone to grow vegetables, let's say, wouldn't make any sense to someone living in Manhattan, but it would in a suburban area. As for me, you know, I was, before we started, I was telling Carly that I was looking at, there's two sets of actions. One's around mapping your local resources, and another is around gleaning. And I find both of those very interesting where I live, because we had one of the most incredible apple seasons this year. And I'm part of another group that has a lot of shared farm equipment that we make available to whoever needs it. And one of the things we have is a cider press. And every year we have a sort of harvest festival at the local grange, and we're there grinding and pressing apples all day, and people bring in whatever apples they have and take home cider. And I was thinking it would be great to map out where the trees are that people have that they're not using the apples from, and allow people to take those apples and bring them down for this public cider pressing. And to be honest, neither of those actions, the gleaning nor the mapping, quite covered exactly what I wanted to do. But they were there, and they gave me the impetus to try to talk to a gleaning organization about creating this map. And that's something that is underway. And hopefully next year we'll have that map for anyone to know that there's trees here and there that they can get apples from. And we'll probably need a second cider press, because, yeah.
It sounds like we're going to be including that good example in the action guide
I hope
shortly.
So.
Great, Steve.
I hope so.
Carly, what about you? Where are you? Any actions that are particularly interesting for the area that you are in, and how you live?
Yeah, sure thing. So for a bit of context, I live in Gaithersburg, Maryland, also known as unceded Piscataway land, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., which is, I would say, pretty corporate dominated and like with a lot of sprawling development. So kind of a least likely place for localization efforts, as it were. The other thing is I moved here 3 months ago. and I'm transient here. I won't be here for a long time. So I guess for me, when I'm thinking about taking action, it's not so much that I'm in a position to go ahead and start things, as many great ideas as there are for starting new programs, but I'm in a position of seeing what's already here. So going back to the mapping topic that Steve mentioned, and also seeing how I can lend my time and energy and resources to organizations that are already doing really great work in this area. So I did that and I found one. And my first action was doing an internship at Foxhaven Farm, which is an organic herb farm, learning center, and wildlife sanctuary just down the road. And so plugging into that community that's really trying to cultivate local economies centered on local living landscapes has enabled me to take so many more actions. So I've joined a CSA, I'm growing herbs, making my own medicine. I've learned about so many local businesses and are supporting those. And I'm able to do more of my favorite action in the guide, which is harvesting wild foods or uncultivated foods. And so I realized that a lot of those actions seem like they're really small and individual oriented, like, what could going out and getting some acorns have to do with systems change? But for me, it really has been such a gateway to learning about systems. When I'm harvesting the food, I'm thinking, I'm learning more about like, what are the local and regional land use policies that are governing like my access to the land, everyone's access to the land, how so many of those are rooted in like trying to strip Indigenous peoples of their food sovereignty and continue to be shaped and formed by adherence to the corporate dominated global economy and to capitalism. And on the other hand, I'm learning what it means to be in reciprocity with the land because like Foxhaven has such an emphasis on land stewardship while foraging. And then thinking about like, how can we create local economies that are based on that reciprocity and relationship with the land? So it seems like a really small and simple action has opened so many doors to me. And I would just encourage everyone with any of the actions in this guide. I believe that when paired with the learning community and the desire for a big picture understanding for the context of the action, any one of them can be your gateway to systems change, no matter where you are.
Thanks, Carly. Alex? You muted.
Yeah, sorry. I was just scanning through the guide. I almost need a guide to our guide because it got so big and long that I forgot all what was in there. But I was scanning it, yesterday and today in preparation for this, and it's like Steve, harking back to something Steve said. Wherever we are in the world today, this global economic corporate dominated system is affecting us and is something to take action against. So in some ways, that's a depressing observation because it shows just how ubiquitous and immense the system is against which we're struggling. But it also shows that you never have any excuse for boredom or inaction. So I was just a few of the examples that I pulled out when I went through the guide that would absolutely be relevant and meaningful, wherever we are. The first one that I saw was this, a law passed in France in 2015 banning planned obsolescence, which they define as deliberately reducing the life cycle of products in order to increase their replacement rates. That's huge, the whole country of France have done that. Very recently in Maui County, Hawaii, in August of this year, the county government passed the most comprehensive restriction of pesticides and synthetic fertilizers on public lands in a major county in the US. Hugely inspiring. If we look at policies around procurement, governments and institutions every year procure a tremendous amount of food, of energy, of materials, and that procurement, those purchases can be directed in a way that supports relocalization of the economy and small-scale agroecology, for example. And there's some really inspiring examples of that. In India, in the state of Odisha, in the east of the country, the government of that state has a millet mission to procure publicly procure organically grown millets and bring them into the public distribution system. And they've been doing that for a few years and have reached over 50,000 farmers to procure these millets from. And this is helping to feed 1.6 million households. So this is a way of really quickly and effectively shifting like the food system in this case. You know, there are examples in the guide of worker-owned food cooperatives that are these like multi-sector food cooperatives. One in Washington State in the US called the Grain Shed, which we recently learned about, which is a worker-owned cooperative, bakery and brewery using 100% locally and organically grown, craft malted, heirloom grain varieties, and helping to seed similar worker cooperatives around their city. Another one in the UK, Organic Lee, a worker-owned food co-op with a 12-acre growing site, communities cafe, market stall, vegetable box scheme, running courses in growing food and cooking. And then on the citizens' resistance to free trade, again, wherever you sit, this is needed. And citizens' movement, citizen resistance, coordinated in solidarity across borders, has successfully scuttled or at least stalled a number of these major free trade, corporate free trade treaties in the past. The Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, RCEP in Asia. Now, much more is needed because there are hundreds of these treaties giving more rights and powers to corporations. Nevertheless, it shows that engaged citizen action can be successful. So that's a form of sort of grassroots bottom-up resistance. We also have top-down renewal. So there's variations on all of these sorts of actions. And then I think lastly, I'll just mention one of the most inspiring to me examples, and it's a project that I have had the great pleasure and privilege of personally visiting in Mexico. Tosepan is it's a network in Puebla, Mexico of 8 cooperatives reaching thousands of small-scale farmers to promote agroecology, but also local renewable energy, local healthcare, herbal medicine. They have their own financing, their own bank, or kind of a credit union. But also importantly, they've resisted the incursion of Walmart into their area, as well as mega energy development projects. So that's an amazing example of more multi-sectoral localization and resistance against this kind of development model.
I'm really glad you brought up some examples, that, really concrete examples of some of the initiatives that we are mentioning in the action guide. And Tosepan here at the end also is a network that we are collaborating closely with in Mexico now, also in connection with.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate that we've tried to identify such examples for each action in the guide. And there are some, really this guide is a reflection and an homage to the worldwide movement that we see kind of coalescing.
Exactly. I want now to move on to some of the questions that we have here waiting for us. So here's one from Marie Emily. How do we balance some of the advantages of globalization brought on by big corporations, not least the facility to run this event on Zoom with localization? Any one of you would like to speak to this?
Well, I would just say
we use the technology, but we're not particularly keen on it. We'd much rather meet face to face, and that's what we are encouraging.
One of the questions in our FAQ is sort of like, why don't we have more guides and guidebooks and toolkits from like the global South, for example? And something we realized in searching for them is that we found a lot of examples of inspiring examples from the global South, but we didn't find as many guides. And one of our speculations is that those kinds of guides are less needed in places that are still less delocalized or more, less globalized. So more agrarian, small scale. So similarly here, I think it's like, yes, we need to have an action guide to localization as a reflection of the fact that globalization has already become powerful, and we need to have a webinar to discuss it because of the problem that exists in the world. That's sort of an unfortunate reality in many ways. It'd be nicer if we didn't have to do such a guide, right? So that's that's one thing. I mean, secondly, you know, I think whether or not globalization as a phenomenon of removing regulations and restrictions on corporate power and investment and movement and mobility, and something like an internet-based webinar, I think that relationship is questionable. I don't think there is a direct causal line from corporate globalization and a webinar, internet webinar. You know, that's just sort of a generic answer. Zoom is one of many platforms. That's another, you know, so it happens to be the one that most people are using, and it is
I think it was just, it was probably just an example, not particularly.
Sure.
Because, yeah.
If I can add something to this, as someone who, I don't know, 30 years ago argued that we shouldn't have a website, back when websites were first coming out, and you know, and I was arguing from a perspective of technological purity, I guess. And the reality is that you can't fight globalization with, or even high technology, without using some of those tools. If you're unilaterally disarming, you're going to become less effective. But I think you have to keep in mind, and I think we are fairly consistent. If you look at our blog or our writings, that we are constantly critiquing high technology, and but in order to reach people these days, we really don't have any choice but to use the technologies that are available. And if the day comes when we don't need them, I for one would be happy to give them up. So.
Me too. We have another question here from Lizzie from Gloucestershire in England. She asks, we have many local food sources and community gardens built into public spaces, or she says, but how do we let people know where to find them? How do we network around large communities? I don't know if here you're meaning, for example, cities. Have you found any good ways of communicating with people about the local resources around, such as community gardens built into public spaces? I must say my own personal experience is that usually community gardens are very highly frequented, and often you have to sort of sign up and there's a long queue for people to join. So I don't know, in Gloucestershire, it must be a problem in Gloucestershire where people are not aware that this is happening. I mean, one thing that I'm taking the opportunity to give an answer to this question is that something that we have talked about as a next project. Carly might mention more about this towards the end, is that we're thinking of making a bit of a template for like a localization action guide that people can make in their local communities. Because someone suggested that to us, and I thought it was a very good suggestion. So that might be, you know, one way of doing it, and having a guide to local initiatives that build community, that strengthen the local economy, that connect people. Because I'm absolutely sure that is needed, even in small places. You sometimes don't know what other people are doing, no?
Yeah,
Anyone?
and I think Yeah, on the particular
Yeah.
point of especially where there are little pockets of edible plants around, or maybe if it's not only community gardens, but also areas that are open to foraging. Incredible Edible, Todd Morden and the entire Incredible Edible movement in the UK would be a really good example of that, because that's all about using all the little liminal spaces we pass every day to grow food and to share for everyone, not just to look pretty. So I'm sure that network has come up with a number of great local solutions, whether that's scavenger hunts or like great signage or hosting events around or frequent plant walks around. So definitely encourage connecting with them.
Here's a longer comment from Roberto Schifo, ISA Energy, who says, I certainly agree that localization is key, just from the point of resilient needs and keeping the wealth local. I would like to add that we also need codependency from the angle of functionalities. For example, he talks about, I won't read it all, about working together as communities, like in a watershed. I mean, I think we at Local Futures really also often point out the localization. By localization, we're not talking about micro-localization, where we are not linking up with other communities. But I wonder if any of the three of you want to answer this in more detail and say a bit about scale of localization.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, it seems to be asking, how we can have very location-specific solutions that really understand, where there's a real understanding of local climate, local resources, the water resources, the soils, and all that. And that's absolutely correct. And we've talked about resistance and renewal quite a bit. And as Alex pointed out, wherever you are on the planet, the resistance side of it, it definitely comes into play. And opposing a free trade treaty, for example, would be pretty much the same whether you're in New York City, or you're in Uruguay, or you're in Brazil or Australia. It doesn't really matter. But if you're trying to work on a renewal project, then you really have to know the location well, and there's no single blueprint that's going to work everywhere. And what it really takes is local knowledge and local skills. One of the pieces, as Carly mentioned, that we'll be working on in the next version of the action guide is to include education. And that's, I think, where a lot of that knowledge is embodied. It's usually embodied in the elders in the community, and yet the education system ignores that kind of knowledge and tries to present a sort of universal knowledge about, say, watersheds, without knowing that particular watershed really well. So yeah, the knowledge of a particular place is a really important part of localization. And that is clearly something that, our efforts to understand our place and to live in it sustainably, it won't work, it won't happen, we'll fail if we don't really get that location-specific knowledge.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with Roberto that codependence is key here. And I think, that is a key component, not just codependence with all the living organisms, but also between people and between communities. No? So I'm going to move on here.
Can I actually add one thing to the previous question about from Lizzie, I believe, about how to let people know about where to find local food. In the guide, we have a section you might check out called mapping, which is located under the community theme. And then under mapping, you'll see one of the actions is called map out local food systems. And so there we've provided a few resources and actions related exactly to that sort of task, including one from England about mapping local food, like a mapping local food toolkit. So this is, and then a couple of examples to get inspired. So may want to check that out.
Okay, thank you. So now let's move on to the question that Emma Butterworth has written here. Really good question. What are the common pitfalls, mistakes groups have made with localization projects in the past? Of course, we can't, take anything exhaustive here, but maybe if any of you have an example, will these be enough to address, I think, the sheer scale of the challenges before us as a global community? I think Emma is referring here to the action guide, the actions in the action guide. But any of you have common pitfalls and mistakes?
Well, I can address the first question.
Yeah.
As somebody who poured a lot of effort into a local currency that ultimately failed. But I think in a broader sense, the pitfall that I worry about the most is that we have to acknowledge that we, assuming we're all products of the industrialized parts of the world, the global north, as it were, that we are in a sense damaged by that we're not as connected to our place as we should be. We're not as connected to community as we should be. And so when we enter into these projects, we carry a lot of baggage with us that can be disruptive or destructive to what we're trying to do. And I think, I live in Vermont. It's a place that it's very, the idea of local food, for example, is really powerful here. There's a lot of small organic farms around. Even though it's a very small town, we have a food co-op. But there's also a nonprofit that started a food venture center, and they use the term local quite a bit. And yet the food enterprises that are being launched through this incubator may be using local ingredients, but their ultimate goal is to become a national product, to sell into the global industrial food system, essentially. And so I think a pitfall is that we often use the word local in a way that's almost, it's trying to use it as a brand to get launched into something bigger. And I'll even mention the food co-op, because it's a struggle that I'm involved with right now, where this is a food co-op that started 30 some years ago as an alternative to the industrial food system. And it always has carried a heavy preponderance of local and organic foods, a lot of bulk foods. But even though we're doing quite well, there is a move afoot to expand, to take over a supermarket in town that's the owners want to sell, and to expand into that by selling conventional foods. And I think that part of the baggage that we carry, even though we may believe that small is beautiful, we also have been taught our whole lives that bigger is better. And that can poison some of the localization efforts that we undertake. This idea that if this is good at this scale, then it would be twice as good at an even larger scale. But that's not always true. And so that, those are a couple of the pitfalls I would point to out of direct experience.
So I'll just add one of my own, and that is particularly if you are starting to work as a group. If you start with a project that's too big, then people get tired and they need, generally they would like to see results quickly. So my experience is that it's better to start with something small where you're guaranteed a bit of success, because that gives an appetite, for doing more afterwards. And then one can take bigger assignments. So it's a good idea to start with a modest thing, maybe something like a single day event, for example, to bring people together around localization, a seed festival or community dinner, something that's doable, rather than, let's start with setting up, say, a farmer's market, which is a bigger chunk. So a little success story first will go a long way. Well, Emma also said,
can I add to her second part of her question?
Please, that's what I wanted.
That's what you were about to do, sorry.
Yes, Alex.
Will these be enough to address the sheer scale of the challenges? Well, no, I think that's why, again, we wanted to emphasize in this guide and throughout our work the importance of systemic policy and legal change, which combined with localization initiatives on the community level, like Steve and Anja have just been talking about, those combined, I think, will be enough, but only community level action, I don't think, will be sufficient to the task. So, if we don't change the way governments spend money on subsidies, for example, subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, the $5 trillion per year or more that now that it goes to fossil fuel or industrial agriculture, then we are, I think it's very, very unlikely and implausible that we'll be able to make the changes necessary in time. So we desperately need to do both.
Which is why we always hammering on about the need to do what we call big picture activism at the same time, to build up a movement that pushes for these policy changes, because that is not something that we can push for alone, right? This need to both speak up and kind of do education for action, if you will, from a big picture perspective, while we are still building up healthier communities wherever we are, no? And hopefully leading a better, more fulfilling life in the process. Now we have another here question from Blaise Mazarant, I think maybe from Canada. We are local initiative LEAP, I think I've heard, Local Education and Action Futures, working to advocate for and bring about localization in our community. Blaise, it would be great if you could write in the chat box where you are. This is very interesting. What communications, if any, do you recommend with local futures and or communities like us using this guide for possible troubleshooting, help on local solutions, or to share our own learning experiences and success stories as we move forward? I'm not quite sure if I understand your question.
Well, maybe, Anja, maybe this has to do with the idea that you've really liked about having future webinars with people who are actually doing some of the actions in the guide.
Good thing. I mean, we're going to
Like
mention
that.
that further along, but now
Yeah.
that Steve brought it on, you know, one of the things that are kind of next steps in this process with the action guide, which isn't a finished product. I'm sure Carly will say something about that. But we are planning to host, if you'll say, an open space regularly every month, where people can meet that are working on localization projects, that want to work on localization projects. That will be an opportunity that, you know, may or may not use this guide, that have some experience or are new to it, where it will simply be a space where we can bring our questions, share our experience, and maybe, you know, together strengthen each other wherever we are in a process of localizing. So this is something we'll be announcing very soon, also the first date, and we want to make that a regular feature. So hopefully that would go some way of possibly, you know, both troubleshooting and learning from other experiences and sharing success stories, you know, and that hopefully can feed into future versions of the action guides as well. So it's getting to be a bit late, so, but I'll just here, we have another interesting devil's advocate question almost from Ian Graham. If there were any corporate executives on this call, you know, decision makers, what would they say to our vision? Now, I think they'll say we are naive and unrealistic.
Well, I think,
What do you
I
think?
mean, I think that they speak a different language, and the language is dominated by ideas like economic growth as a self-evident good, that anything that doesn't promote, or that the only way to solve social and environmental and economic problems is through further growth. And that's such a bedrock belief that I don't think that they can be swayed by what we're saying, because they would see it as not contributing to economic growth, or maybe even slowing economic growth. So in other words, if you start growing some of your own food rather than buying it at the supermarket, GDP is going to go down, and they would see that as a bad thing, and we would see it as a good thing. So we're really speaking different languages, and I think we would have a very hard time reaching them. I don't know, maybe others would argue that we could actually speak to them, but I'm not hopeful of that.
Well, we can speak to them and encourage them to leave and move into the food co-op world, a non-growing network of small-scale enterprises and so on. But yes, there's important worldview issues there, and ways of thinking about values, the fundamental underlying values that we believe in and work towards. I think a lot of people in the corporate system are not necessarily passionately loving that. I know people who are in it, and yeah, the system itself just sort of chugs along and has its own rules of behavior. I think Jerry Mandel was the one who wrote about the rules of corporate behavior. Will throw out the conscious CEO and replace him with someone else, as long as the need to return higher profits every quarter is one of the rules governing the institution. So those rules have to change.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly a couple things. I have spoken with several corporate CEOs about these issues, and I guess I'm reflecting that it's not even though this guide is largely comprised of facts in a way and concrete guidance, it's not the head that's going to save us here, it's the heart. And like having those experiences of being connected with local living economies are the thing that will turn around, that is the thing that will turn around people who might not have otherwise been exposed to that and like don't even know how to begin speaking that language. It will start from here. That's all.
And I would add that I think a lot of executives from the corporate world would nod with approval to a lot of the actions. For example, you know, setting up a community garden, or some of the things that are have to do with creating better communities, healthier communities. They'd probably feel that that's good initiatives. I think where they'll question is our vision is questioning, where we question and want to dismantle the corporate control and the corporate economy and the growth economy. No? And I think that's where we tend to disagree with people.
But
have a lot of
I would add, because Ian asked about decision makers, not just corporate executives.
Oh, right, that's true.
And our guide is full of great examples, especially of city governments.
Yeah.
Where decision makers have done the right thing and are absolutely on board with like radical food sovereignty policy agenda, for example.
Exactly.
Or restricting pesticides in Maui, like I mentioned, or whatever it is. So many decision makers. So that's something to think about, is supporting.
Yeah, and that's two different groups, no? That's true for and you know, today there was the 7th Economies of Happening conference going on in the city of Jeonju in South Korea. We've had a long-standing relationship with that government, and they are hugely, strongly committed to both the process of, you know, shifting from global to local and building up a city based around well-being and happiness at the heart of it. So that's just one example. So at the end here we have, oh no, not at the end. We have a comment from Lowell Design, who this is more of a comment, a personal comment about the difficulty that he or she has had with connecting with his or her Chinese suburban big city community around urban agriculture, and also with the local NGOs. And I think I would invite you to join our first open session, because this is something that we could talk about there, and there might very well be some good ideas about how you could connect, not just from us, because those open sessions, the intention is not that we're going to sit there as any experts. We're going to be there together with others that will have experience and ideas as well. So keep your eyes open for our announcement. And then hello, Melissa. There's a question here from Melissa in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The banks have stranglehold on the status quo. How to make changes in spite of the banking opposition to change? Anyone?
I've got a great answer for that. Steve, over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, there are some things in the guide about moving your money out of big banks into credit unions, about starting your own bank or credit union. about public banking, and all of those steps are pretty small in relation to the size of the problem, the amount of power that the banks have already accrued. Well, and I think that this is why really there is a need for a very powerful localization movement. If you know if we divide ourselves into camps that are focusing on climate change over here and economic inequality over there, and you know, saving small farms over here, we're going to be so divided that we'll never have the critical mass that's needed to take on these large and powerful institutions like corporations and banks. It's our hope that this guide, if people read the big picture parts and the intros to each action, that they'll start to get the sense that all of these seemingly disparate problems are connected, and that we can possibly address all of them simultaneously through this global to local shift. And if that happens, there is the possibility of creating a movement that is large enough to take on these institutions. Right now the politicians are in the pockets of those banks and corporations, but if they actually feared the electorate a bit more than they do, it is possible that change would happen. In the same way that, you know, Alex talked about these government initiatives, not at a national level, but at a state and regional level, where they are taking steps in the right direction. That's clearly from grassroots pressure, I'm sure. So it's a formidable challenge, but I think that our only hope is to really join together and have a united front against these huge and powerful institutions.
Which implies calling for the re-regulation of the finance sector, no? As well as, you know, reining back their ability to make money out of thin air. Even our governments are borrowing money from private banks, you know, and getting into debt. So that's one of the things that the positive money movement is advocating for. No? That we need to take the money making out of the hands of private banks and financial institutions. So that concludes the end of the questions here. Now, before we end, and also at the end here, Carly, you will be saying a little bit about the next steps, right? But before that, I have a question, which is, what are your major takeaways from working on this project, on this guide for so long? Did you learn anything new? No takeaways. Sad.
Well,
all right.
I mean, I will say that I felt quite hopeful after, you know, when you scan through the huge breadth and scope of how many things are going on in the world, most of which I didn't know about. It does give you a sense that there is a localization movement already underway. And even though many of the participants in that movement probably don't see them, they think they're working on some specific thing, but it is, it's all connected to this localization movement. And I think it's another testament to the fact that the mainstream media and even our internet news feeds largely ignore all this stuff. We don't hear about this without really digging for it. But that was my main takeaway, is that there is a lot going on in the world today that's really good. And it's and I'm sure we're only scratching the surface in this guide.
Yeah, I will just echo what Steve said. I mean, you know, having to and getting to really find examples of initiatives and projects that illustrate each of the actions we are featuring was really inspiring. And just you know, it's just like Steve said. Steve already said actually everything, but I'll just say it. You know, it's such a tiny sliver of what all is going on. So we've done our best to try and provide a, you know, a sort of a broad spectrum of those examples from as wide of a geography as possible. But as we mentioned at the outset, this is just a first sort of a first step, and improvements surely can be made, and we definitely want to increase the geographic spread and representativeness of it. So request everyone tuning into this to please help us in that effort through our suggestion form. Yeah, Carly.
Yeah, I think y'all have pretty much said it all. I have a great job. I feel very lucky that I have gotten to research these and to connect, however remotely, with all these amazing organizations every day. I guess one thing that also really struck me through creating the guide was that we all know that we need to like shift subsidies, shift taxes, shift these huge systems. And so this guide gave us an opportunity to figure out, how do we actually do that? Like, what does that mean in terms of action? And I suppose I was hoping that through the process of researching, I would find some sort of very concrete action for how to do that. Okay, like this is the answer. But I realized in the end, it's kind of what Local Futures has been saying all along. No surprise. It's the big picture education, just like having the courage to be honest with ourselves and go through all the grieving processes of like being honest about the state of our world today, like sharing that space with others, sharing what we learn with others, bringing these conversations into the open, you know, figuring out how each of us in our own context can engage in non-participation from these systems. And really, in the end, we're going to have to all band together as a huge movement. That spans all of these sectors, if there is any hope of that. So yeah, so I think we are doing that, all of us here on this call, like through every one of the guides you take in the action, again, no matter how small it seems, is contributing to that. So just keep having those conversations, you know, keep exploring, keep learning. Our team has certainly enjoyed doing that. We've had many amazing conversations through this guide, and I've grown so much. And yeah, it's been a privilege to work on it, and I'm so glad that you all are here with us today and are enjoying using it.
Carly, just before we finish, can you say a little bit about our next steps?
Sure. Yeah, so we have many ideas, many contributed from the community about how we can grow this guide in the coming years. For most immediate next steps, we're planning two series of talks. One will be a Voices from the Field webinar series that in which once a month we'll have a webinar with somebody who's really gone deep in engaging with one or more actions of the guide in kind of a multi-sectoral localization context. So this will be a chance to hear from someone who's really doing this groundwork, ask questions, and yeah, space for us to just come together like as a global community and get a fresh perspective to bring back to our local work. So that's one series. And then the second one will be our localization open spaces, in which we'll have a monthly space where folks can just come and chat with us about what you're doing on the ground, what obstacles you're facing, what you'd like to be doing, hear from other people around the world about what they're doing for localization. So again, a chance for us to come together, like feel like we're part of a broader community in an area when it can feel so isolating sometimes to be engaging in this work. So we're looking forward to both of those. Hope to see some of you there. And we also have beyond that, a number of other ideas and projects in the works, like Anja mentioned earlier, potentially figuring out what it would look like to develop a series of a way for people to make a counterpart to the action guide in their local language and adapted for local context, as well as, we'd like to add more themes to the guide and make some other changes. So yeah, this is in a way only just the beginning, and yeah, looking forward to having y'all join us on that process.
Yes, so we'll thank you, Carly. We'll follow on with more information soon. We'll have our first Voices from the Field webinar in November, and so we'll be announcing that shortly, as well as the date. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. There were some familiar names. I wish I could say hi to you, and also to all of you I haven't met before, also on Facebook, and then there'll probably be people watching this afterwards as a recording. We're really encouraged by the interest in the guide, and we're also very, very relieved that we finally got it launched after all those kind of years of question, what can I do? And now we feel we have at least a decent answer, which is of course not the final one, as Carly says, because we'll be growing this guide, and we hope others will make other guides in other languages tailored to their place, and with a lot of examples from their area, because obviously there's so much going on, so we can't bring it in all here. So enough for us today. And have a good evening, day, wherever you are, morning. And we hope to see you again at the Voices from the Field, and for our open space to discuss how we move on with localization wherever we are. Bye for now. Thank you.